By the autumn of 1897, Cora Vance had $11 to her name, a wagon with a cracked axle, and a dog who refused to leave her side. She had just lost the only home she'd ever known, sold out from under her by the bank that once shook her late husband's hand and called him neighbor. So when she spent her last $11 on a condemned smokehouse nobody else in Ashford Creek would touch, the whole town decided she'd finally lost her mind along with everything else. They watched her walk the property line with her dog, Scout, at her heel, and they laughed behind their hands at the widow who'd traded her dignity for a pile of rotting cedar boards. They didn't know that dog would put his nose to the floorboards on the very first night, whine like he'd found a ghost, and refuse to be pulled away. They didn't know what waited beneath that floor had been buried there for 30 years, waiting for someone honest enough to find it. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Cora Vance and her faithful dog Scout. If you've ever been counted out by people who thought they knew your worth, or ever turned over something plain and found it was treasure all along, tell us in the comments. We want to hear it. The build-up. 3 months earlier, Cora Vance had been a woman other women envied, quietly, the way you envy someone who has built a life you'd be proud to call your own. She and her husband, Daniel, had worked their 160 acres outside Ashford Creek for 9 years, coaxing wheat and sorghum out of ground that fought them every season. Daniel had a laugh that carried across 2 fields, and a way of catching Cora's eye during Sunday service that still, after all those years, made her feel like the only woman in the church. They had no children, a fact the town's more careless women liked to mention, but they had each other, and they had the land, and for a long while that had been enough. Then came the fever, the one that moved through the county like a rumor nobody could stop, and it took Daniel in 11 days. Cora buried him on a hill overlooking the wheat he'd planted that spring, and she told herself, the way grieving people do, that she would manage. She had managed. She'd brought in that year's harvest herself, sold it fair, and made the mortgage payment on time, same as always. What she hadn't accounted for was Silas Redmond. Silas ran the Ashford Creek Trust and Savings, the only bank for 30 miles, an institution his late father, Elias Redmond, had built from nothing, or so the story went, the story Silas told at every town supper, and every church social, the story of a self-made man who'd arrived with a mule and a dream, and turned it into the finest brick building on Main Street. Silas had his father's narrow eyes, and his father's talent for smiling while he took something from you. When Daniel died, the loan on the Vance farm came due for review, a formality, Silas had said, nothing to worry about. Cora had believed him, because believing people was still, at that point, a habit she hadn't broken. The formality became a demand for immediate payment in full. Cora didn't have it. No widow farming alone would have it, and Silas expressed his deep regret as he foreclosed on the only home she'd ever made, standing on her porch in his good wool coat, twisting his hat in his hands like the whole business pained him terribly. It didn't pain him. Cora saw that clearly, the way you see a snake clearly, once you know to look for it. He wanted the water rights that ran through her southern acreage, rights that would let him control irrigation for half the valley, and a grieving widow with no children to inherit the fight was the easiest kind of obstacle to remove. The town watched it happen, and mostly looked away. A few women brought pies, the way they do, as if pie could stand in for justice. The men tipped their hats and said it was a shame, and went on doing business with the bank that had done it, because that was how a town like Ashford Creek survived, by not looking too hard at the man who held the paper on everyone's future. Cora had one thing left that the bank couldn't touch: Scout, a lean brown and white cattle dog with one ear that never stood quite straight, a dog Daniel had raised from a pup and trained to work the herd, a dog who had slept at the foot of Daniel's sickbed every night of that terrible fever and hadn't left it until the end. Scout had grieved too, in the silent, watchful way dogs grieve, following Cora everywhere afterward, as though he'd appointed himself her replacement husband, her guard, her whole remaining family. When the wagon pulled away from the farm for the last time, Scout sat in the back and looked at the house until it disappeared around the bend, and Cora had to look away from him, because his sorrow was too much like her own. She took a room above the mercantile for a week, paying with money she couldn't spare, the little space smelling always of flour dust and lamp oil drifting up through the floorboards from the store below, trying to decide what a woman with no farm, no husband, and no prospects was supposed to do next. Ashford Creek wasn't a large town, and word of her situation traveled the way word always did, fast and unkind. She heard the whispers when she walked to the well. Poor Cora Vance. Should have remarried the moment Daniel passed, before the bank could smell the blood in the water. What's she going to do now? Take in washing? The pity was almost worse than the cruelty, because pity assumed she was finished, and some stubborn ember in Cora refused to agree. The morning she moved out of the farmhouse for good, Cora walked every room one last time, running her hand along the mantel Daniel had carved the year they married, the doorframe where she'd marked their good years in pencil lines she'd never gotten around to measuring against a child, because there had never been a child to measure. She had packed what fit in the wagon, and left the rest, unable to bear the thought of Silas Redmond's men handling it, and she had locked the door out of pure habit, a widow's habit, locking a door that no longer belonged to her. Scout had refused to get in the wagon at first. He'd stood in the yard, barking once, sharply, at the empty windows, as though he expected Daniel to come out onto the porch the way he always had, calling the dog in for supper. When Cora finally coaxed him up onto the seat beside her, he turned around 3 times, and settled facing backward, watching the farm recede, and he stayed that way until the road bent north, and the house was gone from sight. She understood the feeling exactly. She had spent 9 years building a life she assumed was simply hers, the way you assume the ground beneath a house is solid, and she was only now learning what everyone eventually learns. That very little in this world is as fixed as it feels while you're standing on it. It was old Mrs. Abernathy at the mercantile who mentioned it first, half as gossip and half as a kindness, the way she mentioned most things. The old Coleman Smokehouse, out past the eastern ridge, the county was finally auctioning it off, the taxes unpaid for years, nobody wanting a scorched, half-collapsed building on a scrap of land too rocky to farm. It had belonged, decades back, to a blacksmith named Ezra Coleman, a freedman who'd built his forge and his smokehouse with his own 2 hands after the war, and who had vanished from Ashford Creek so suddenly and so completely, sometime in the late 1860s, that people still argued over what had become of him. Some said he'd gone west, some said worse. The land had passed through the county's hands ever since, unclaimed and unloved, a rumor of a place more than an actual property, and now it was going for a price so low it was almost an insult. "Nobody in their right mind wants that pile of char," Mrs. Abernathy said, not unkindly, "but it's yours for $11 if you want a roof, Cora, even a bad one." Cora had heard the old stories about Ezra Coleman, the way most everyone in Ashford Creek had, in fragments, at church suppers and quilting circles, never quite whole. He'd come to the county not long after the war, a broad, quiet man, with hands scarred from forge work, and he'd built his smokehouse and his little forge with a patience the older folks still remembered, working sun up to sundown for years without complaint, mending plowshares and shoeing horses for anyone who'd pay him a fair wage, which in those years had not been everyone. He kept to himself, mostly, though he was known to be generous. Mrs. Abernathy's own mother had told her once that Ezra Coleman fixed a broken wagon wheel for a stranded family free of charge, the winter of '71, and refused even a meal in payment. And then, one spring, he was simply gone. No goodbye, no note, no wagon seen leaving on the road east or west. The forge went cold. The smokehouse sat empty. Some said he'd gone looking for family further south. Some, in the uglier corners of town gossip, suggested he'd gotten himself into some kind of trouble and run from it. Nobody, in 30 years, had ever suggested the truth, that he'd been running from something, rather than toward it, and that Ashford Creek's finest family had been the reason why. Cora had $11. She had, in point of fact, exactly $11, and a dog, and a wagon with a cracked axle, and nothing else in the world worth counting. That night, she sat on the boarding house steps, with Scout's head heavy in her lap, and thought about Daniel, and about the hill where he was buried, and about how a woman who had lost everything still had to wake up the next morning and decide something. She decided that a bad roof was better than no roof, and that she would rather own something worthless outright than rent something decent from people who whispered about her. We should tell you now, what Cora bought for $11 that autumn was not, in fact, worthless. But it would be another 2 weeks before she, or anyone, understood exactly how wrong the whole town was. She signed the county papers the next morning. The clerk didn't bother hiding his amusement, and by noon half of Ashford Creek knew that Widow Vance had spent her last cent on Ezra Coleman's ruined smokehouse, and by supper, the story had already curdled into the shape it would keep for weeks. Cora Vance, so undone by grief she'd thrown away her last coin on a burnt shack nobody sane would touch. She heard a boy repeat it to his mother outside the church, unaware she was close enough to catch every word. She kept her chin up and her eyes forward, the way you learn to do, and loaded her few remaining possessions into the wagon with the cracked axle, and drove out past the eastern ridge with her dog sitting tall and watchful beside her, toward the one piece of ground in the county that was, finally, entirely her own. The discovery. The smokehouse sat low against the ridge in a stand of old pine, and the first thing Cora noticed, climbing down from the wagon, was the smell, not smoke, not anymore, but the deep, resinous scent of aged wood and cold ash that clung to the walls the way memory clings to an old coat. The building had survived better than she'd feared, and worse than she'd hoped. A squat, single-room structure of hand-hewn logs. The roof caved in on one corner, where a pine bough had come down some winter, the door hanging by a single leather hinge that had long since dried to the stiffness of old rope. Ezra Coleman had built to last, that much was plain in the joinery, in the way the corners still held true after 30 years of neglect. Whatever had driven him away from Ashford Creek, it hadn't been because he built things carelessly. Scout was out of the wagon before Cora had even set the brake, nose to the ground, moving in the quick, purposeful circles of a dog who has caught a scent worth following. He worked the perimeter of the building twice, then planted himself at the threshold, and would not go farther, ears back, a low, uncertain whine building in his throat. "What is it, boy?" Cora asked, and Scout looked at her the way he used to look at Daniel when a storm was coming, a look that said something is not right here, and I do not like it, and I am staying close to you regardless. Inside, the smokehouse was dim and close, lit only by the gap where the roof had failed, dust hanging gold, and slow in the single shaft of afternoon light. Old iron hooks still hung from the rafters, black with age, and the floor was packed earth gone hard as brick, except, Cora noticed it almost by accident, crouching to examine a fallen beam, except for one section near the back wall, where the dirt looked different, looser, darker, as though it had been disturbed once, long ago, and never quite settled back to match its surroundings. Cora spent that first evening simply making the place livable, patching what she could of the roof with canvas and rope, sweeping 30 years of dust and leaf rot out the door in great gray clouds, and setting up a cot and a small cook stove in the corner farthest from the collapsed roof. Scout would not settle. He paced the small room in restless loops, returning again and again to that darker patch of earth near the back wall, sniffing it, backing away, sniffing it again, whining low in his throat the way he used to whine at the barn door on nights when a coyote was working the fence line. Cora tried scolding him gently, tried offering him a bit of jerky to distract him, and Scout took the jerky, chewed it without enthusiasm, and went straight back to the patch of dirt, as though the food meant nothing beside whatever he'd caught the scent of. "You're going to wear a hole clean through the floor," she told him, half laughing, half unsettled by his persistence, and it was only the practical thought of losing sleep to a fretting dog all night that finally sent her, candle in hand, to kneel down and look more closely at what had him so troubled. Scout noticed it before Cora had finished noticing it herself. He pushed past her, sniffed once at that darker patch of earth, and began to dig. He dug the way Cora had only ever seen him dig at a gopher hole, frantic and low, throwing dirt back between his hind legs, whining with every third or fourth motion, a sound with an edge of something that wasn't quite fear, and wasn't quite joy, urgency maybe, the sound of a creature who understands a thing is important before he understands why. Cora knelt beside him, more out of concern for her dog's nose and nails than any real expectation, and began clearing dirt with her hands. Her fingers struck wood. Not floorboard, something buried a good foot and a half down, a plank surface too smooth and too deliberate to be anything but built. She and Scout worked another quarter hour together, woman and dog shoulder to shoulder in the failing light, until they'd cleared enough soil to see the outline of a lid, iron-banded, set into a shallow pit someone had dug and covered with real care, 30 years or more gone by. A pit like that doesn't dig itself, and a man like Ezra Coleman didn't bury things he didn't intend to come back for. What Cora didn't yet know was that she wasn't the only one in Ashford Creek who remembered this old smokehouse existed at all. The lid wouldn't lift at first, rust and time had welded the hinges nearly solid, and Cora had to work a fallen roof beam under the lip as a lever, straining until her shoulders burned, Scout barking encouragement from a safe distance, refusing to come closer to the pit itself, but unwilling to leave the building either, as though standing guard over the work even as he stayed clear of it. When the lid finally gave, it came with a groan of protesting metal and a puff of stale, mineral-smelling air, the scent of rusted iron and old cloth, and something underneath both, something like coal dust. Inside the pit sat a strongbox, iron-cornered, banded in the old style, its surface pitted with rust, but its lock, remarkably, still intact. Beside it lay a smaller bundle wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff and brittle with age. Cora sat back on her heels, heart hammering, and looked at Scout, who had crept forward at last to sniff the strongbox once, then sat, very deliberately, right beside it, tail sweeping the dirt in slow, solemn strokes, not the wild joy of a dog who'd found a rabbit, but something quieter, almost reverent, as though he understood this was not a game. It took Cora 3 days to find a locksmith willing to make the trip out from the county seat, 3 days in which she told no one in Ashford Creek what she and Scout had found, 3 days of lying awake in the half-repaired smokehouse listening to the pine trees and wondering what a freedman blacksmith would have buried so carefully and never returned to claim. She kept the strongbox covered with a horse blanket in the meantime, and twice in those 3 nights, she woke to find Scout not curled at the foot of her cot where he usually slept, but stretched full length across the blanket itself, chin on his paws, as still and watchful as a hound carved onto a tomb. She had never seen him guard anything so deliberately in his life, not even Daniel's sick room, and it frightened her a little, the seriousness of it, as though the dog understood something about the weight of what they'd found that she herself hadn't fully grasped yet. The locksmith who finally came, an older man named Purnell with a kit of picks and files worn smooth from 40 years of use, worked the ancient lock for the better part of an hour, muttering about rust and old craftsmanship, while Scout sat pressed against Cora's leg the entire time, ears pinned flat, watching the stranger's hands with open suspicion. When the lock finally gave way, what she found inside took the breath clean out of her. Gold, not a fortune by the standards of the mining kings out west, but a substantial sum, dust, and small nuggets, carefully weighed and bagged, the kind of gold a patient man might collect over years of quiet panning in the creek that ran behind his forge, a creek that, Cora would later learn, still bore traces of color if you knew where to look. Beneath the gold, wrapped in the oilcloth, lay a ledger in careful, precise handwriting, and a bundle of letters, and a folded document that made Cora's hands go cold when she understood what she was reading. A mining claim, filed and recorded, in the name of Ezra Coleman, for the very creek that ran along the Redmond family's land. The ledger told the rest, in Ezra's own patient hand. He had found color in that creek years before Elias Redmond ever built his bank, had filed his claim properly and legally, and had been paying a man named Elias Redmond, not yet a banker then, just a man with a store and a talent for lending money at ruinous rates, to hold his savings safe, since no bank in the territory would open an account for a black man in those years. Elias had taken the gold and the trust, and had then quietly filed papers disputing Ezra's claim, using friends in the county office to have the boundary lines corrected, in the Redmond family's favor. Ezra Coleman had seen it coming, the ledger suggested, in its last entries, had grown afraid, had buried what he'd already saved rather than let Elias take that too, and had apparently fled Ashford Creek before whatever came next could reach him. Scout, through all of this reading, lay with his chin on Cora's boot, occasionally lifting his head to nose at the strongbox, as if to make sure it was still real, still there, still worth guarding. When Cora finally set the ledger down, her hands trembling, she understood two things with sudden terrible clarity. The first was that she was holding proof the Redmond family fortune, the bank, the fine brick building, the water rights that had cost her own farm, had been built on a theft 30 years old. The second was that Silas Redmond, if he ever learned what she'd found, would move heaven and earth to bury it again, this time for good. The climax in karma. Word travels strangely in a small town, not through any single loud voice, but through 100 small ones, each repeating a little of what they've heard, until the truth arrives somewhere far stranger than where it started. By the second week, Ashford Creek was murmuring that the widow Vance had found something out at the old Coleman place, something valuable, and though nobody knew precisely what, everybody had a theory, and Silas Redmond heard every one of them. He came to the Smokehouse himself, on a gray Thursday afternoon, driving a fine trap with a driver up front, dressed as though he were calling on a lady rather than a woman he'd thrown off her own land 3 months prior. Scout met him at the property line before the trap had even fully stopped, hackles raised, a low, steady growl rolling out of him that Cora had heard perhaps twice in the dog's whole life, once at a rattlesnake, once at a drunk hired hand who'd raised a hand to Daniel. Silas eyed the dog with real wariness, and kept his distance, calling out his business from the safety of the trap, rather than approach on foot. "I hear you've had some good fortune out here, Mrs. Vance," he said, in the warm, regretful voice he used for foreclosures. "I'd hate for a woman alone to find herself in possession of something she doesn't fully understand the value of. The county records on this parcel are complicated. I'd be glad to help you sort them out, for a fair price." "The records are perfectly clear, Mr. Redmond," Cora said, standing her ground on her own porch step, Scout pressed against her leg, still rumbling low in his chest. "Clearer than I think you'd like." She had thought, driving out to the Smokehouse that first day with $11 and a cracked axle, that her fight with Silas Redmond was finished, that he had already taken everything from her he meant to take. Standing on that porch, watching his careful, practiced regret curdle into something colder and more calculating, she understood it had only just begun, and that this time, the stakes were not a mortgage or a water right, but the entire story the Redmond family had told about itself for 2 generations. A man like Silas did not surrender that story easily. He had built his whole sense of himself upon it, the way another man might build upon land or money, and Cora had just shown him, without meaning to, that the foundation beneath it was rotten clean through. Something shifted in Silas's face then, the smile going thin and careful, and Cora understood she'd confirmed exactly what he'd come to find out. He left without pressing further, but 2 days later, the county surveyor arrived unannounced to re-examine the boundary lines, and the day after that, a lawyer's letter came by post, questioning the validity of her $11 purchase on a technicality buried in the original tax auction notice. Silas Redmond was not a man who lost a fight in the open. He was a man who won them quietly, on paper, in rooms where the other party wasn't present to object. Cora understood, watching the pressure build with each passing day, that she could not win this fight the way Silas fought it, with lawyers, and paper, and friends in the county office, resources she simply didn't have. So she chose a different battlefield entirely. She wrote to Ezra Coleman's family. It took nearly 3 weeks, and the patient help of a minister in the next county who kept records of freedmen congregations, but she found them at last. Ezra Coleman had a daughter, grown now, married, living 2 counties east, who had spent 30 years believing her father had abandoned the family out of shame or cowardice, unable to protect what was his. Cora wrote her a long letter, and enclosed a copy of the ledger's final pages, and waited. Scout curled at her feet through every anxious evening, his head lifting each time a wagon passed on the road, as though he too were watching for an answer. The answer came in the form of Naomi Coleman Price herself, arriving in Ashford Creek on the same train that carried a state land commissioner Cora had also written to, a commissioner with a professional and entirely unsentimental interest in fraudulent boundary corrections 30 years old. Once Cora had laid out, in careful and specific detail, exactly what the original ledger proved. The confrontation, when it finally came, happened in the county courthouse itself, in front of half the town, who had gathered on the rumor that something extraordinary was about to unfold. Silas Redmond arrived expecting to argue a property dispute with a grieving widow he could out-lawyer without effort. He had not expected Naomi Coleman Price, holding her father's original, properly filed mining claim. He had not expected the land commissioner, holding 30 years of county boundary records, that, once compared side by side with the original survey, showed the correction for exactly the fraud it was. And he had not expected Cora Vance, standing quiet and unshaken at the front of the room, Scout sitting rigid and alert at her side, to produce Ezra Coleman's ledger and read from it, in her own clear voice, the entry describing a payment of savings entrusted to one Elias Redmond, who has promised to hold it safe, for there being no bank in this county that will hold it for a man like me. The room went very still. Cora watched something crumble in Silas Redmond's face that had nothing to do with the money, and everything to do with the story he'd told about himself and his father for his entire life. The self-made man, the mule and the dream, collapsing in front of the only people whose good opinion had ever mattered to him. It did not go easily after that, but it went the way justice sometimes actually does go, slowly, and through proper channels, rather than through any single dramatic reversal. The land commissioner voided the fraudulent boundary correction and restored the original claim to Ezra Coleman's rightful heirs. Naomi Coleman Price, in a gesture that brought half the courthouse to tears, insisted on splitting the gold and the restored water rights with Cora, for finding what my father buried, and for finding me. Silas Redmond, facing a formal fraud inquiry into 30 years of his father's business dealings, and the sudden, public collapse of his family's good name, quietly resigned his position at the bank he no longer had the town's trust to run, and left Ashford Creek before the spring thaw. Cora used her share of the restored water rights to do the one thing she'd wanted most, and never dared hope for. She bought back her own farm, at auction, from a bank now under new and considerably more honest management, and she used the remaining gold to dig the town's first proper well on the east side, the side where the poorer families lived, and had always had to haul water the farthest, the side Silas Redmond had never once thought worth the expense. The well digging itself took the better part of a week, and Cora made a point of being there every day it lasted, standing in the cold morning air with a shawl pulled tight, watching the men work the shovel and the winch, listening to the steady scrape of iron against rock, and the particular, hopeful sound water makes the first time it rises to meet the light. Children from the east side of town gathered to watch too, unable to quite believe that clean water might soon be closer than a half-mile hauling trip, and Scout, delighted by the crowd of small hands eager to scratch his ears, allowed himself, for the first time since the whole ordeal began, to simply be a dog again, rolling in the dirt, chasing a thrown stick, barking at nothing in particular just for the joy of the sound. Naomi Coleman Price stayed in Ashford Creek through the well's completion, and she and Cora spent long evenings together, going through the rest of Ezra's ledger, piecing together a fuller portrait of the father Naomi had spent 30 years believing had simply given up on her. She wept, reading his careful, patient handwriting, at the entries where he wrote of missing his daughter's birthday, of hoping to send for her, once the claim was properly settled, of trusting, wrongly, tragically, that a written agreement with Elias Redmond would be honored the way it would have been honored between two white men of business. He didn't run because he was ashamed, Naomi said quietly, the ledger open on her lap. He ran because he was afraid of what a man like that would do to protect his lie, and he was right to be afraid. It just took 30 years and a dog for the truth to catch up. Scout, through the whole long unraveling, never left Cora's side. Not in the courthouse, not at the well digging, not on the morning Cora walked back onto her own land, for the first time in half a year, and stood a long moment, looking at the hill where Daniel was buried, telling him, quietly, that it had all come out right in the end. The dog who had guarded a stranger's buried secret, with more loyalty than most men manage for their own kin, sat beside her through every bit of it, one ear up and one ear crooked, exactly as he always had. Outro. There is a kind of value this world is slow to notice, buried in condemned buildings, in overlooked women, in patient men who saved what little they had, and hid it rather than lose it to someone who'd never see them as an equal. Ezra Coleman's gold sat in the dark for 30 years, worthless to no one, and unclaimed by everyone, until a woman with nothing left to lose, and a dog with an honest nose, decided a burnt smokehouse was worth $11 and a chance. The town that once laughed at her, now draws its water from a well she paid to dig, and not one of them, walking past that well on a hot afternoon, ever seems to remember the joke quite the way they told it back then. So we'll leave you with the same question Cora asked herself, kneeling in that dark, dusty pit with her dog beside her. If you found a hidden piece of history, buried and waiting, would you keep it for yourself, or would you go looking for the person it truly belonged to? Until next time, stay close.